Okay, so we are on to our last chapter. We're going to be talking about personality here. Um, Simply put, when we are looking at personality, we are looking at you, who you are as a person, and the way that, as this says, you think about things, how you feel, you act. When you are projecting yourself out to somebody else when you are in school or when you're at home. What is it what are the things that you do, what are the things that what are the ways that you act, defines who you are. So we're breaking this down into three major sections. We'll start by talking about the way in which we test personality. So that's what we'll do in this video. The next video, we will talk specifically about Sigmund Freud. And then in the last, talk about some of his theories on psychosexual development. Then we'll talk a little bit more about his defense mechanisms, and we'll round that off by talking about neo-Freudians, and we will call it quits there. So let's start with so let's start with projective tests. And projective tests are a way to measure a person's personality, and I want you to go back and think about introspection. So if you remember introspection from History and Approaches very early on, Wilhelm Wundt, structuralism, you were having the person look inside themselves, see what's going on in there, and then express what they see. And in a similar vein, projective tests are going to have the patient do that, but do that unconsciously without them thinking about it. That's the idea. The projective test is to get the person to look inside themselves and then express what's there without them even thinking about it, without them, actively doing so. And so it's not about trickery, but it's about getting the person to express those things without, like, thinking about all that. So we have a few examples of different types of projective tests that we're going to go through, and we are going to start with not the most famous one. The most famous one is the Rorschach. You guys. We'll cover that in just a minute, but let's start with the TAT test, the thematic apperception test. So this was created by Christiana Morgan and Henry Murray. And basically, the way that this works is a patient is shown a ambiguous picture, a picture that could have several different meanings. And then what was asked of the subject was to tell a story, explain what is happening inside of that picture. So let me show you an example of a TAT picture that they would use. So normally they would give you about 20 of these simple ambiguous pictures for you to look through and express, but this was one of them. And so take a moment and look over this, and in your head, what is this a picture of? What is going on in this story? And what you'll find is that many people see many different things. Some people will see, oh, this is a woman, her husband just died. Or this is a wife whose husband is sick. Or maybe he's drunk and he's coming home again and, he's passed out. Or maybe there's a woman on the other side of the bed that he's sleeping with. Lots of different ways of seeing this picture. And what I want you to think about is that this is an opportunity, this is a way for the psychologist to then have a better understanding of their patient, know a little bit more about this person. Why is it that you saw the fact that he was drunk? Is this something that could, clue into what's going on in their life? Um, And so they use these pictures to, get a little bit of a better understanding of what is going on. The end result is all subjective. This is going to be between the patient and the psychologist, and their discussions and the interpretation of what the subject said it was in the picture, once again, is going to be completely subjective, to what the psychologist believes. So that is the thematic apperception test. So next, we're going to move to the Rorschach Inkblot test. Now, this is a more famous um, test. This is the most famous of the projective tests. It's the most widely used. Basically, what is happening is a patient is shown 10 ink blots that look like this here. They're all different. So I'll just show you one of those. So this, as I said, all you're doing is you are looking at this and you are expressing what you see. And the psychologist will take that information and plug in some deeper meaning into what it is. Obviously, there's some controversy over whether or not the TAT, not the TAT, the Rorschach Inkblot test does anything, but this is just something that you need to be familiar with, the Rorschach Inkblot test. So the next is what is known as the Blacky's picture test. The Blacky's picture test is a another projective test, and it's really strange. Um, but in this test, which was mostly given to children, you would basically have the children look at the different pictures of Blacky the dog, and you would have them basically respond um, and tell stories about what is happening in the pictures. They have some words here at the bottom, but there would be nothing here for the child to look at. It would just be, okay, what is happening in picture A? What is happening in picture B? And so on and so forth. And the child would express what was going on. Now, this is very specific to Freud's psychosexual development stages, which we will get to in the next video. I have honestly never seen this on the AP exam, but this is one that you never know. It could possibly crop up. But once again, this is just kind of frightening and weird imagery that goes with understanding how a child develops mentally and their personality as they get older. Okay, so next we have personality inventories. We are no longer talking about projective tests. We are now talking more of a um, self-applied, self-determined um, test where a person is no longer, kind of projecting out with this ambiguous information. Instead, they are really kind of doing a questionnaire. What is your feeling on this? What do you believe about this? How does this concept apply, excuse me, to you? And so, what the patient is going to be doing is we'll talk about a couple of these, but they are talking about how um, uh, it's another way of showing a person's personality, but with less ambiguous usage. So the first and probably the most famous and the most widely used is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Now, the MMPI is is well known because of, in some ways, it's like really kind of weird and crazy. There are a total. It was created in 1943. There are a total of 567 true or false questions. Um, and while the MMPI was created for very specific things. Um, it it's a bunch of, like I said, true or false statements that create scores that are built on 10 scales. So basically, they are measuring things like depression. They measure things like the psychological disorder schizophrenia, a person's masculinity or femininity, and so psychologists dealing with certain patients will use this to better understand where a child is, or where an adult or a teenager is, mentally. And one of the interesting aspects of this test, and I'll show you some really weird questions from it, is that it catches people in lies. Um, One of the reasons why it is so long is because it has the ability to, so many of the questions feed off of each other. So if you answer a question one way and then you answer another question a different way, it it catches whether or not a person was being truthful. So think about it this way. If you had schizophrenia and you sensed spirits or ghosts or whatever as part of this schizophrenia, and you didn't want to go to a mental hospital, one of the questions might ask, do you see, and there's a question on here that's like, do you talk or hear spirits? And you 100% do. But if other people know that you do that, you're going to go into a mental hospital, and you don't want to do that. So you say, no, I definitely don't hear or see those things. Well, what's going to happen is later on in the test, there's going to be another question that will check to see whether or not. So if you answered false on that first question, and then later on you answered something true, well, that's going to point back to that first question and be like, well, if you answered false here, because you answered true down here, that means, whoop, you lied on that first one. So it helps psychologists catch whether or not someone might be lying about certain things, in order to, help those people get the help that they do actually need. Okay, so that's the MMPI. Now, the other type of personality inventory is known as the California Psychological Inventory. And this is really just another example, a different type of MMPI. This one's a little shorter. There's only 462 true or false items. And this is a little less focused on certain personality disorders and more focused on just personality traits, things like dominance, sociability, self control, um, and things like that. So less focused on, like, hey, can we pull out these specific types of psychological disorders, and more like, hey, let's just kind of get an overall view of a person's personality. Now, as a part of these different psychological disorders, we have a concept known as the Barnum Effect. Now, the Barnum Effect is something that you might have stumbled on when you were taking one of those online personality quizzes. One of those, like, I don't even know who does them anymore, but you're scrolling through, Twitter or whatever, and they have these random, like, take this, what Hogwarts school would you go to? Stuff like that. And so the Barnum effect as it says, is the tendency to accept certain information as true, specifically when that information is really vague. Now, if you get a chance, I'd read this little comic strip, which I think does a very good, um, really expresses what that Barnum effect looks like. But basically, um, oftentimes when you create very simple or stereotype statements, um, people will readily accept those statements. So statements like, "Oh, you are sometimes really outgoing, but other times you really just like being by yourself." Um, or statements like, "You have an intense desire to get people to accept and like you." Or sometimes you give too much effort on projects that don't work out. And these things we might be like, whoa, like that's totally like me. And of course, it's like you, it's like everybody. It's just so open-ended that it fits with everything, and so people are just like, "Oh my gosh, that's crazy." It's not crazy. It's just it's how everyone feels about it. Okay, so that's a Barnum effect, and that is a wrap up of the different types of personality testing. Good work, everyone.